All very interesting. Good on you, Pete.
Thank you, Macca.
That's what's it called? Homefront?
Homefront celebration at the Woolston Farmstay Heritage Site just at WWII.
That's today.
Right, in about another hour's time.
All right, mate. Good on you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, I'm Dennis Udovicic. I'm from GI Inc. We're putting on display at Woolston Farm. The things we've got on display today is all the accoutrements of what the soldier of World War II, US soldier of World War II was using. Here we have a ration display, we've got a medical display, and we're hoping to educate people today of what the soldier of World War II lived and how his life was.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was aware that it was 12 o'clock and we're now in the afternoon, certainly not the evening. Welcome to our session to talk a little bit about Brisbane in World War II and also some of the local history of this area around us, WWII, and the National Trust's property at Woolston Farmhouse and the nearby Camp Columbia precinct. So this is a discussion for the next half an hour or so before the band starts up again. We'll know we've come to the end of our time when that happens. But I'm Jeff Ginn. I teach history at the University of Queensland, and Paul Budd will be speaking after me, talking a bit more about the specific local history of the WWII area during World War II. Now, obviously, this is an extraordinarily evocative site. It's evocative for the colonial period, but it's also, you need to remember that these sorts of sites remained occupied throughout their history. And if you think about the landscape around us, particularly in the neighbourhood, the vicinity, you're able to then project yourself back into some thoughts, some awareness of how that landscape was being used during the war. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about studying history, teaching history, is you have a chance to exercise that projection where you can imagine the past landscape, you can imagine the people that lived there, you can imagine the circumstances, the factors that shaped their experiences as they lived through such a tumultuous period as World War II. And I guess the key thing for us is that we often think about World War II as a global event, but hopefully what we're about to say will help you bring it down into the immediate vicinity and get a sense of how that global event played out here in Brisbane. That photograph is taken at the University of Queensland. I actually work in that building. My office is down that end. That was the largest building in Queensland pretty much in 1940 when it was finished, being built for the University of Queensland, and was taken over by the Australian Army, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go along. A few broad reflections and observations on the state of the war in 1939-1940. Of course, when the war broke out in Europe, it was a long way away. And it's pretty fair to say that most Australians treated it as a distant conflict that Australia would participate in on the British side, much as had occurred in World War I, that Australian forces would go overseas. So the key thing is, at this time, Australia had a population of 7 million. Of that population, you can see how many served in uniform, men and women. And you can see 39,000 killed and 66,000 wounded. You can see the cost, the toll that took in human terms on the Australian population. And you'll also notice that proportionate to the number of casualties, a very high number of prisoners of war. And that really has shaped the Australian experience and the Australian memory of World War II in a really fundamental way. But as I say, Australia was a smaller participant in this global conflict. And to begin with, it seemed like a very, very distant conflict on the other side of the world. And so when Australian forces were sent overseas in 1939-1940, they were part of an imperial strategy, run from London, essentially. And Australians were sent to the Middle East in order to prosecute the war in the Mediterranean, in order to take on the Italian presence and then later the German presence in North Africa. So the fact that Australian forces were contributing to that and were being sent, the 6th and 7th Divisions were sent to the Middle East. And then the 8th Division was only deployed to Malaya when the likelihood or the potential possibility of war with Japan started to become evident during 1941. So when you think about how the war came home, it's really a series of steps. Japanese expansion in the Southeast Asian area involved attacks on the Philippines, where the Americans were, on the French forces in Indochina, on the Dutch forces in the Dutch East Indies, and on the British forces in Malaya, what is now Malaysia, and of course Singapore. So you can see this quite dramatic strategy simultaneous attacks in Southeast Asia at the exact same time as the attack on Pearl Harbor. And people are often not aware of that fact. But a war was commenced on multiple fronts by the Japanese, with an attack on Pearl Harbor and at the same time an attack on the British colonial possessions in Malaya, and with an intention to seize the British naval base in Singapore. So you can see how rapidly that advance occurred. And at this point in time, what they call ABDA Command was formed, and that was a combination of American, British, Dutch and Australian forces under a single command structure. That was a short-lived arrangement, given how rapidly the Japanese offensive secured all of these territories. And you can see again that broad strategy and the capture of Singapore in February 1942, and then the capture of the Dutch East Indies by March 1942. So this was the moment where Australia faced a sense of an imminent threat, and this was the one really crystal clear moment in Australian history where that thought of an invasion from the north was now manifesting as a reality. So 1942 was a crisis year in Australian history. Literally, the war came to our shores when Darwin was bombed. You can see the Battle of the Coral Sea. You can see Japanese submarines in Sydney Harbour. You can see MacArthur leaving the Philippines. That's the American general who was in the Philippines, left the Philippines with the success of the Japanese offensive. Townsville was bombed, and then the first land battle that saw the repulse of the Japanese advance at Milne Bay at the end of August 1942. But there'd been a series of very dramatic reversals prior to that point. The retreat down Malaya, the surrender in Singapore, the defeat of the Dutch East Indies. This was an imminent crisis point in terms of global strategy, but also in the sense of Australian vulnerability to the north. So if you think again about how this starts to manifest at home in our immediate neighbourhood, General Douglas MacArthur, now commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, decides to establish a headquarters in Brisbane and arrives in Brisbane in July 1942. Now this is celebrity moment for Brisbane. MacArthur is a big personality on the world stage. He always had presidential ambitions. He was a big picture, American general. He had a very powerful commanding personality, and he was easily the most famous person in Brisbane for the whole time, he was here. It was also the beginnings of large numbers of American service personnel start to arrive at the end of 1941 into 1942. And there are extensive preparations with bomb shelters, with dugouts, with schools establishing slit trenches in case of air attack, and so on. Testing drills, which of course were needed in the north because there were in fact bombing raids. There were in fact points where the Japanese Air Force was bombing these sites and people needed to respond through bomb shelter provisions and so on. And it also meant a period of what we now think of as total war, mobilising the total resources of any given community or society or nation. And so the fact that women were being enlisted, or women enlisted in great numbers, the establishment of the various auxiliary forces, Australian Women's Army Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the naval equivalent, these are all being established as part of this expectation that the nation at large will call upon all its resources, and women joining the Australian Defence Force in large numbers as part of this kind of national mood of mobilisation. And there was also the so-called Dad's Army, with World War I veterans re-enlisting in World War II Volunteer Defence Corps, veterans from the first AIF now getting ready for the threat of a home invasion. Again, this is a very Queensland story because Queensland was on the front line. And so really for the foreseeable period of this imminent sense of invasion, it was really very clear in the Australian consciousness that for the first time Brisbane was the place, and north of Brisbane, the rest of Queensland, was very much the focus of defence planning. And so as you see, there are a number of evacuations, a number of civilian preparations, state schools being closed in North Queensland, the evacuation of population. So Townsville's population, its civilian population reducing substantially through evacuations, but then largely being extended by the arrival of Australian and American service personnel. And then you can also see the investment that occurred in order to boost transport and other infrastructural connections across Queensland. So fundamental highways, really important elements in the road network, bridges, a lot of civilian infrastructure being built in order to mobilise resource capacities across Australia, particularly across Queensland, in order to prepare, firstly, for the Japanese invasion, but then as a stepping point for an Allied strategy to then reconquer those territories and push back the Japanese territorial occupation. So Queensland is at the forefront of a defensive effort with a lot of focus, particularly on the Sunshine Coast area. That's where they were seen as being the most likely for a seaborne invasion. But then when that moment passed, Queensland's becoming the stepping point, if you like, for a counter-offensive to reclaim those occupied territories across Southeast Asia. And this is where the theme of the Brisbane line comes in, because people often know this story, especially if you live in North Queensland, the notion that North Queensland would not be defended, that in fact Allied defence would be south of Brisbane. And this became a very powerful story in the North. It was certainly discussed as a strategy, and there was a sense that minds in high places had made a decision to essentially abandon the North. But you can essentially see a series of points there that were de facto policy rather than any formal defence policy. So there's this notion that the Brisbane line is kind of a furphy because no one actually ever planned to abandon Queensland to any any enemy invading force. But at the same time, that was never formalised as an explicit strategy. It was mooted and discussed and kind of considered as a series of options. And indeed, from MacArthur's own report on Australian defences from 1942, this is where the idea that it was a substantial policy comes from. It was mooted, it was discussed. In a way, it was openly discussed, but then it was subsequently treated as if a decision had been made to abandon the North, when in fact no such decision was ever made. And it was also in the context of an election campaign where they were seeking to discredit the previous government and potentially garner votes in North Queensland, which we all know is a great strategy. So how does this impact on Brisbane, which is where we start to get closer to home? Well, Brisbane is a sleepy subtropical town. It's a city, really, but it always has a town feel to it through this period. Brisbane's always described as a country town that's finally having its moment, where it grows up and becomes a city. This is one of those moments where in David Malouf's semi-autobiographical novel, Jono, he talks about how extraordinary it was for that generation to suddenly be on the front page of the news. This was a distant, far-away global event, but all of a sudden, here we were on the newsreels. I really love that description. Our sleepy subtropical town with its feathery palm trees, its miles of sprawling weatherboard buildings, all of a sudden, we're the forefront. All of a sudden, this location is at the epicenter of this titanic global struggle. The other thing that people remember about this period, the Brisbane line is one of them, is the friendly invasion. The number of American GIs that arrived, the number of them, the Hollywood glamour of them, the cut of their uniforms, the size of their pay packets, and their courtesy towards women. Right? So this is one thing that Australian men really responded very poorly to. First of all, their uniforms were better. Secondly, they were paid better. Thirdly, they looked like they were Hollywood stars, and they also were courteous in a way that Australian men simply weren't. And this turns into quite a kind of toxic combination as time goes on. But essentially, Queensland was the most affected of all the Australian states. More American GIs came through here, did training here, filled the streets, had their parades, but also had their training camps, had their operations and practice. They're practicing amphibious landing on Bribie Island, and so on. But essentially, you can see the numbers are always very hard to pin down. At any one time, up to 80,000 American soldiers based in Brisbane and up to around 2 million across the duration of those 3 or 4 years of the war. So it's a huge cultural and, I guess you could say, it's a cultural presence, but it's also, again, manifesting this idea that Brisbane was somehow at the forefront of this global story, this moment of global drama and crisis. So Americans were very popular. They were largely welcomed, good relations. But as I say, there was certainly, when it came to rivalry with Australian servicemen, that was a big issue from the start. Americans were overpaid, oversexed and over here. Australians were undersexed, underpaid and under MacArthur because, of course, he was the supreme commander of Allied forces. So technically the Australians were under his command. And the notion that the American servicemen had more... were better paid and also had access to the things that would attract female attention, things like stockings, makeups, cosmetics, cigarettes, and so on. So this whole, the glamour of the Americans together with their ability to draw the female gaze. To capture female attention was really a big deal. And Australian male resentment famously builds up. Here's a Japanese propaganda poster, because the Japanese were well aware of these kinds of potential tensions. That's, sort of puts it really in propaganda terms. The Yank says, "Quiet, girlie, calm yourself. He'll be on the new casualty list, the next casualty list. No need to worry." And this, of course, famously flares up into the Battle of Brisbane, which again is one of the legends of the local story. It is a story of the American build-up. It is the story of resentment amongst Australian men, Australian male service personnel, about their privileges and about their status and about their success in getting Australian girlfriends. So there is a dispute, and I can't go into the details of exactly what pans out, but it's significant that it happens outside one of the US canteens, and it turns into a riot in that canteen. The American soldiers take refuge there. They call military police, more military police, because it was an altercation with the military police that was the source of the problem. It's essentially a riot. And then when more military police are called, in the American way, they come with shotguns and batons. And so an Australian serviceman is killed. And then up to 8 were wounded through gunshot fire by these American MPs, right? So it's a pretty, what's the word when something is on edge? It's a highly volatile situation. And this is a spark that kind of ignites it. The thing that really strikes me, though, is that the aftermath says a lot, because there were 2 or 3 days after that, certainly the night after, and then sporadically after that, where Australian servicemen would go out as like vigilante groups and would find Americans and beat them up, and it was like pretty unpleasant, actually, because there was essentially a larger alliance, but there was this moment of tension flaring up, the so-called Battle of Brisbane, but it's the long aftermath over the next 2 or 3 days, not just the incident itself, that people are thinking about. And the interesting thing about the Battle of Brisbane is it's been mythologised because there was virtually no reporting of it at the time. It was censored, it didn't appear in the newspaper. A very heavily doctored version appears in the Courier Mail, but the Chief Censor's Office made it pretty clear. It was never published in the American media, the American press, made it very clear that this would only injure Allied relations, and therefore it was not to be reported upon. So it's one of the reasons why the mythology has built up the way it has, is there's not a lot of contemporary reporting at all. So Brisbane is an Allied capital. I'll quickly go through the final couple of images here. You need to think about the big personalities. MacArthur with the Americans, Australia's later Field Marshal, General Sir Thomas Blamey, again a big personality, a former police commissioner in Victoria, very big kind of figure in the popular imagination. And you can see there's a third element to that story. We think about Brisbane as being a focus for an Australian service presence, and the Allied through the American service presence. But as Paul will explain, there's a third ally that's important in that story as well. And that's the story of Camp Columbia, which Paul will take up with us. So I'd like to... Thanks, Paul. Yep.
So as part of the series within this podcast, to break up Paul's speech, I am recording with various people interesting snippets, and we've got Joe here from Worldwide Metal Detectors Club volunteer group, and Joe found the ceremonial sword, which is really the centerpiece of the Camp Columbia presentation here today. And Joe, just tell us a little bit about the bottle dump and how thrilled you were when you found that particular ceremonial sword.
Well, we're absolutely thrilled, but at the time my son and me were actually digging out an old bottle dump from Wacol, in the Wacol area, and my son actually pulled the sword from the ground. We didn't really know what it was. We thought it might actually just be a wall sword from back in the day, something that was just a replica of something. But then as obviously time went on, we realised that it had links to the Netherlands, and I guess that's the story. I've met Paul Bundle and he had it authenticated for us, and here we are today.
So hangs the tale of 1,000 spirits, I suspect. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Really good.
Yep.
Thanks.
So I was going to do an introduction for Paul, but he can do it.
And actually, I keep this slide on because lots of you, I think, will come from this area. Yeah, and I've got this slide in my presentation as well, but we can use this now as well. So my name is Paul Budde. I'm the chair of the Camp Columbia Heritage Organization. We established ourselves a couple of years ago. We are looking after the last remnants of Camp Columbia, which are in Poole Corner, the bushland area in Wacol, opposite the prison site, yeah, on the other side of the road there. Yeah. But this is a good start because here is where we talk about the headquarters. Yeah, we are now here. Yeah, with at the Brisbane River, and then you see this is altogether 20 by 15 kilometers of military activities that in one way or another were linked to Camp Columbia. Camp Columbia was the administrative head office. Everything was coordinated from here, and then you see all these activities happening. In Archerfield, there's the airport, and there's a big picture over there that you can see later. That was in 1947 when the last Dutch plane left Brisbane. On the top of the plane, you see all the Dutchies, and on the bottom of the plane, you see all the Australian personnel. It's a really interesting picture to have a look at in a minute. So that was happening here. Transport, ammunition, all sort of maintenance, all of these facilities were there. Now, part of the plan at Camp Columbia Heritage Association is that we actually want to make it very clear in this area where these sites are and they fit together, so that people who live here, there's tens of thousands of people who are living here who would not have a clue that what important function their area had in World War II. And Sarah Hutton, the councillor in charge of the area where we are, is very keen to actually start using that. And we link that in with the program we have with UQ, with Jeff and his students, to actually start looking at Camp Columbia, then the area around here, yeah, how important that was, as then Jeff already mentioned, how that fits into the Brisbane situation, how the Brisbane situation fits into the World War II in the Pacific, and how World War II Pacific fits into the global war. So that sort of story is what we would like to talk about. By the way, this new equipment, worth $10,000, what we have organized as the Camp Columbia organization, together with Wacol Farmhouse and the National Trust, is that we are going to use the National Trust facilities to actually organize students, primary school and secondary school students, to come here and start telling the story of World War II. So far, Woolston House has told the story about 1840 to 1900. As Mac, I don't know if you heard that in the beginning, but perhaps not. When this property was started to be developed in 1840, 1850, the whole area, all the way to Oxley, was one big property, cattle property. So everything that you've got now in Camp Columbia, all the sort of things you saw in the picture before here, were all part, originally, yeah, of this long grazing property that was established in 1840. So therefore there is a logical link to combine Camp Columbia and Woolston House. In World War II, Woolston House was also used by the Americans, yet for, commendated by the Americans to, as other properties here in Wacol, for hospital or administration or recreation or whatever. So this whole area was actually under the American, originally the American occupation or, allied forces in that sort of situation. Yeah. So we are trying to get heritage listing. We are cataloging the remaining elements. We've got a map on one of the banners there that shows the area where we are. We have also, as you can see, lots of the artifacts that you see here were actually found at Camp Columbia, including the sword, the ceremonial sword that you see in the display over there. So they were all found here. So we've got lots of remnants, lots of stories to tell about medals and coins and badges, about what happened in Camp Columbia, what happened in the broader Wacol area here in this situation. So we do pop-up exhibitions, as you can see here, and we are very keen in making the broader history known, and particularly, as Jeff also already mentioned, we are talking about Brisbane as the Allied capital of Australia during World War II. So far, it has been, the MacArthur, and the MacArthur Museum in town. That has been the story, but we want to broaden it. It's far more, and I spoke to this about the Lord Mayor, and he really liked that, that Brisbane was the Allied capital, of Australia during World War II. Of course, the Australians, the Americans, the Dutch, and the Brits, all were here, and they all had their head offices in one way or another, in Brisbane. So it's pretty important to, focus on that, and we also can use that in promotion and things like that to promote Brisbane as such an important town in that time. We've got several sites here that we know there were Aboriginal camps, so it's already used for a long time. Then the Stephen Simpson was the guy who set up Woolston House. He was also the border police magistrate. So there is already, from the very early time, there is that link with policing, military, etc. from the 1840s. So we've got the QDF, the Queensland Defence Force, was using part of the site. All of this, is basically indicating, hey, interestingly, we have this long-term history where actually Woolston House, Camp Columbia, and other elements fit in. I showed this map. I think, we can skip that further, but this is important to keep. Now here you see some of the facilities: transport, ammunition, administration, hospital. This was at the station. One of the reasons why Wacol was also selected was because of access to the railway station. The railway station was very important. Also to the north, that's, as Jeff already mentioned, Townsville, Rockhampton, etc. But also supply from Brisbane, from the harbour, where all these supplies arrived, and they could go to Wacol here. And of course, military personnel, when they were free, they could go actually from Wacol easily back into town for entertainment and things like that. There were 3 hospitals on this site, 3 military hospitals. They were basically tent hospitals, so were temporary hospitals, which is quite interesting. We've got a website, campcolumbia.com. What is it? .com.au, and we've got lots of pictures of that. It's really interesting to see, as Jeff also mentioned, that landscape area, what all happened in this area. Not necessarily that all these remnants are there, but you can walk through a part of bushland, and you can actually know that was a hospital, that people were treated here, people died here, and things like that. I think that storytelling is one of the most important things of Camp Columbia Heritage Association that we want to do. Okay, it's nice to have some foundations from a hut, and we've got a sewer installation, and we've got a little bridge, and we've got all sorts of other things in Pooh Corner Reserve. But I think the stories behind it is actually what makes it very interesting. So the Dutch came here in 44. So in 42, as Jeff mentioned, the Japanese conquered what was called Dutch East Indies. It was a Dutch colony. Later on, of course, it became Indonesia. And 20,000 people from the Netherlands fled to Australia. Because the Netherlands was occupied by the Germans. They couldn't go back to the Netherlands, so they ended up in Australia. And then you have to imagine that. So suddenly there are 20,000 Dutch people. They can't go back to the Netherlands, they can't go back to Indonesia, they have to find some way of organizing themselves here, and they were allowed to set up the Netherlands East Indies Government in Exile. It's the only time that there was a government in exile in Australia, and that was happening in that particular period of time. Now, that means that there had to be administration, there had to be military head office, there had to be, hospitals. There were a couple of hospitals involved for Dutch military and things like that. They had to organize the liberation of the Netherlands East Indies. And later, the Dutch wanted to recolonize the Netherlands East Indies. That didn't really go well. But in any case, they tried all of that. And they had to give permission, get permission, of course, by the Australian government to do all of that. Now, the Dutch didn't have supplies, so there was always a fight about supplies. Yeah, the Dutch wanted ammunition, the Australians wanted ammunition, the Dutch wanted planes, the Australians wanted planes, and both of them, were short of that. Then there was always this fight with the Americans. The Americans could supply that, but they will use it for themselves. So a whole situation of diplomatic activities that are taking place in a situation like that. If you start thinking about it, oh yeah, there was a government in exile. The Dutch military were allowed to wear weapons. Yeah, so they were wearing weapons. While here in Brisbane, they could arrest Dutch people. Yeah, all of these things are, of course, need to be put in a sort of a policy as well. So it's quite interesting to see that happening. So here you see the headquarters. This is what's now the prison. The Dutch flag is here. And UQ started to do some archaeological research funded by the Dutch government in a couple of years ago, 1919. But you can imagine digging holes in a prison was not very popular. And, and even if we did find something there, we couldn't do anything with it. You couldn't get visitors coming to the prison and say, look, here is something from World War II. So we abandoned this. And then thanks to the help of some people that did find, as metal detectors, some of the stuff that you see here, we were actually directed to the Poole Corner area. There were remnants. That was public area. It was owned by Brisbane City Council. They were very happy that we would like to do something with it, etc. So that's how the whole thing started. And a lot of the metal detectors, remnants that they found, as I mentioned, are on display here. This is the last remaining hut that's still here. It's used by the Pistol Club. And, here you see some of the big huts. This was the mess, yeah? And here you see the back gate, and you see a couple of females. Because, as I mentioned, the Dutch didn't have staff. So there were thousands of Brisbane people that worked for the Dutch, either at Camp Columbia or at Archerfield, as you can see on the picture there. So, there are lots of interaction with Dutch people and Australian people, of course, at that time. And then you might recall after the war, that whole area became, areas where migrants started to work. So lots of Dutch people ended up in that area. So there is still the Dutch shop there. There was the Lions was set up by the Dutch, as Hollandia, a soccer club. So there's a lot of Dutch history after the war that actually is also connected to, to what happened during the war. Yeah. And here you see that the Wacol migration camp. Some of you might have relationships, going back with your family in that area. So these are the huts that were used by the military, are now used for migrants to come in. And, quite some 10,000 migrants came to Wacol. It was the largest migrant camp in Queensland. And that lasted till the 1980s. But again, it's quite interesting. We've got stories from people from the Wacol migration camp. Very few actually knew that they were in the camp that was set up by the Americans and used by the Dutch during World War II. So what happened, of course, after the war, that the Dutch stayed here in Brisbane because they wanted to liberate the Netherlands East Indies. MacArthur had bypassed the Netherlands East Indies. They went from New Guinea straight to the Philippines because he had promised, I come back, yeah, because he was kicked out in the Philippines by the Japanese in 1941. So, he said, I come back. So he was keen to actually bypass the Netherlands East Indies and actually go to the Philippines. And actually, that was a very clever strategy because suddenly large part of the military were stranded and, they couldn't do anything, than just surrender. So it was a good strategy as well. But the Dutch had tried, of course, come and help us, and liberate the Netherlands East Indies as well. So then you had a huge gap in the situation that you had the bombing of Hiroshima, yesterday the 15th of August VP Day, and then you had, from a Dutch point of view, you had this whole, what's now Indonesia, full of Japanese, yeah? The Japanese had put all the foreigners, Dutch and Chinese and others, in camps, and these camps had now to be protected because the Indonesians wanted independence. So they started what's called the Bersia period, and they want to kill everybody, that was not standing in the way of becoming independent. So the Dutch then had to come up with relief. Camp Columbia became also a refugee center. So people that were malnourished were brought to Australia, and in other parts of Australia, of course, they were recuperating, but also here in Brisbane. And slowly, of course, the situation was so that Indonesia wanted independence, and they got in 1949, they got their independence. And we've got one lady here, I know perhaps more, that actually was part of that whole Indonesian situation and came to Brisbane. So we still have these living stories of people that have actually experienced what we are talking about. And on our website, you will find lots of these stories that we want to, particularly of course around Camp Columbia, that we want to preserve, make sure that we actually can use that. Now, over the last year, so last year we had a big symposium, international symposium, supported by all the Allied forces. We had the Americans involved, the Australians involved, the Dutch involved. We got money from the federal government. This is one of the things we bought from them. The Dutch funded the symposium, and that became actually a new stepping stone for us. As a direct follow-up from that, we started to reconnect with UQ, and we started to reconnect. We made contact with Jeff Jin, and start looking at, okay, how can we actually make it a more permanent situation that students are starting to research. Perhaps archaeology from the universe can start looking at what we are doing. So that's a process that actually started, I think, this month, so next month, Jeff. Yeah, with the first students becoming involved in the history of this site. And next year we're starting looking with the archaeological department of the universities to start looking at archaeological sites on Poole Corner. At the same time, we have an MOU with the National Trust of Australia, which own this property, and we are going to use this as our education centre. The Wolston House people, the National Trust people, have an educational program, as I mentioned, for students, and they're going to integrate World War II in their story, and some of the displays and banners and things like that will be used to tell the kids the stories about it, and particularly, of course, again, schools from this area. They will tell the parents, and slowly, I think, hopefully, we get this story across how important Brisbane was, but also how important this particular part of Brisbane was, yeah, all the way to Oxley and Archerfield, etc. Yeah, about this site. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
You're now live. Give us a little bit of your background.
What, our unit?
Yeah.
Okay, our parent unit was the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles, 1939 to 1943, and then it was disbanded, but there was only a few members left during the war. The Australian government restarted the regiment in 1953 as the Papua New Guinea Volunteer Rifles, and that's what we represent today. But that unit has since been disbanded.
And you've got a museum, haven't you?
We've got a museum out at the former WWII Army Barracks, open the first Saturday of each month from 10 to 1, and we've got everything in there.
So just tell us a little bit of what you've got on display here and point to it.
Okay, we try to cover, apart from what you see here, World War II and post-World War II. We've got heaps of photographs, weapons, all rendered no good. Weapons, we've got ration packs, we've got a Japanese, see it over there, woodpecker, machine gun, being neutralised. Just a whole lot of historic stuff.
And do you do school visits?
Sorry?
Do you do school visits?
Yes. Yes. We do school visits. We have school and cadets visiting our museum by arrangement in advance. We can usually handle about 25 to 30 students at a time and take them right through, usually on a Saturday and a Sunday.
Very good. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Peter's at Ipswich. What's happening, Pete?
Good morning, Macca. I'm actually at Wakaraka, which is just outside of Ipswich. I just dropped off some luggage for some cyclists who are cycling on the Brisbane Valley Rail Trail. And now I'm on the way to the Homefront Festival, which is this year's Brisbane celebration of VP Day, which was yesterday, Victory in the Pacific. And it's being hosted at the heritage site of the former Camp Columbia, which is now Wilson House. And it's going to be a really fantastic day with some of the speakers from the Camp Columbia Heritage Association doing addresses on what is really an incredible piece of Brisbane's history when it was the headquarters of General MacArthur. And I don't know if you knew or not, there's over 240 pure World War II memorials in Brisbane, as many in Brisbane as what there is in Hawaii, believe it or not.
I wonder why that is.
Well, as I said, it was the headquarters of General MacArthur. There was a submarine base in the Brisbane River. There was the South Brisbane Dry Dock, which was repairing dozens and dozens of war-damaged ships. The Cane Cross Dock was built just towards the end of World War II. There was Eagle Farm, there was Archerfield. It was just a hub of the American headquarters of the Southwest Pacific as we fought the Japanese.
All right. So that'll be a big day, Pete.
It will be incredible. A fellow called Camp Boodle, Paul Boodle, I should say, is doing some really interesting discussions because the only time in Australia's history where there was a government in exile was based in Brisbane, which was the Dutch East Indies government from Indonesia. And at Camp Columbia, they've done archaeological digs. They've found some incredible memorabilia from the government in exile and also the American occupation of that particular site. And it's now part Wilson House. It's part forestry area called Pooh Corner because there was a sewage works there. And that's where they've actually done a lot of this archaeological digs because it was a rubbish dump, sewage works, and, you know, people's occupation, everything gets thrown out in the tip, everything gets shoved down the toilet. So it's a really productive place to do some archaeological digs. And they found a dagger, believe it or not, from the West Indians government in exile on the site. So it's just amazing what comes out of some of these heritage sites in Brisbane.
Speaking of MacArthur, there's a hotel in Sydney called the Grace Hotel, which is a lovely, lovely, I don't know if it's Art Deco or whatever, but MacArthur stayed there. I suppose before he went to Brisbane, but he stayed there for a good while at the Grace Hotel, and there's little plaques and memorials there about that time in our Australian history. So there you go.
You know, one of the most interesting places to visit in Brisbane is the MacArthur Museum, and that was his headquarters for 3 or 4 years. And VP Day, even though MacArthur was based outside of Brisbane at the time, his main headquarters and family was still based in Brisbane. And he had flown into Brisbane and was actually in Brisbane when when the surrender was announced. Incredible as that may sound.
All very interesting. Good on you, Pete.
Thank you, Macca.
That's what's it called? Homefront?
Homefront celebration at the Wilson Farmstay Heritage Site just at Waco.
That's today.
Right, in about another hour's time.
All right, mate. Good on you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.